Hi everybody, welcome to our February story time. I'm Ellen Clara from Read Santa Clara. And I'm really excited to get to share with you a lot of stories and songs from American folklore. It's all part of our history here in our country. Everybody's family has a story about how they came here and where they've lived and what they've done. And our whole country has a history of what's happened here, both good and bad. But let's start with one of my favorite songs, and I hope you like it too. Bingo, B-I-N-G-O. And if you remember how we do this, we're going to sing the song and all the way through and say all the letters, spell Bingo's name, and then every time I'm going to turn over a letter, and when I turn over a letter, instead of saying the letter, we're going to clap. So here we go. Was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, B-I-N-G-O, B-I-N-G-O. B-I-N-G-O, and Bingo was his name. Oh, so now I'm going to turn over the B, and now when we sing, instead of saying the B, we're going to clap one time. Was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, I-N-G-O, 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 and Bingo was his name. Oh, so now I'm going to turn over the I. So now we're going to clap two times. Was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, N-G-O, 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 and Bingo was his name. Oh, all right. Turn over the N. 3 claps, 2 letters. Was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, G-O, 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 and Bingo was his name. Oh, here we go. This is always the hardest one for me. 4 claps, 1 letter. Was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, O, 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 and Bingo was his name. Oh, all right. Last time. No letters. 5 claps. Was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, and Bingo was his name. Oh. There's a long history of stories in American folklore called trickster tales, where somebody small and smart uses his head to trick somebody who's big and powerful. And this one is from the African American tradition. It's called the Great Tug of War. You see, what happened was one day Rabbit was out walking about when he came upon a very strange conversation between the elephant and the whale. The elephant said, "You know, whale, I'm the biggest and strongest on the land, and you're the biggest and strongest on the sea. And because we are, we can boss everybody else around and tell them what to do. And if they don't do what we say, well, we can sit on them." And Rabbit and Whale agreed. "You're right. You take the land and I'll take the sea, and we'll boss everybody around." Well, Rabbit heard this and he thought, well, they might be the biggest and they might be the strongest, but I don't think they're the smartest. I'm the smartest. And in the meantime, Elephant had gone back into the forest, and Whale had gone back into the sea. And Rabbit hopped on over to talk to Elephant, and he said, "Hey, Mr. Elephant, you know, you are big and strong, and I could use your help. I've got a cow, and he's stuck down in the mud at the beach. Do you think if I got a rope that maybe you could grab that rope and pull him out?" And Elephant, he'd like to hear it when people said nice things about how big and strong he was. He said, "I sure would be happy to do that for you, little friend." And so the next thing you know, Rabbit went over and he talked to Mr. Whale, and he said, "Hey, Mr. Whale, could you help me? You're so big and strong, and my cow, he's stuck in the woods. His feet are stuck in the swamp, and I can't get him out. No way. But could you help me pull him out?" And the whale did the same thing. He liked it when people told him how big and strong he was. He said, "Sure, Rabbit, I'd be happy to help you." So Rabbit went and he got his rope and he got a drum. And he took the rope and he said, "Hey, Mr. Elephant." And he gave the elephant one side of the rope. And then he took the other end. He said, "Now, Mr. Elephant, you just wait a minute and I'll get down to the beach and I'll tie it onto my cow. And when you hear my drum, then you pull and you'll pull my cow out." And he took the other end of it and he gave it to Mr. Whale. And he told Mr. Whale to do the same thing. So then Rabbit got as far away as he could from both the elephant and the whale, and he started to beat his drum. And when he beat the drum, well, the elephant, he started pulling and pulling and pulling. And he pulled so hard that he flipped Mr. Whale out of the ocean and onto the beach. And Mr. Whale, he didn't know what to do because he couldn't hold on. So he flipped his tail up in the air and took a great big dive down into the water. And when he pulled on the rope, when he went through the water, well, he pulled old Mr. Elephant all the way down to the beach. And old Mr. Elephant said, "I don't know what's going on here." And he pulled again on the rope, and who should come up out of the water but Mr. Whale. And Mr. Elephant said, "Mr. Whale, what are you doing here?" Mr. Whale said, "Why, I was helping Rabbit with his cow." Mr. Elephant said, "I was helping Rabbit with his cow too. But I think he fooled both of us because we were both pulling on the same rope." Ooh, that rabbit, we see him again. We're gonna do him in, that naughty rabbit. Well, Rabbit didn't quite know what to do because he didn't want those big animals coming after him. And he went into the woods and he found this old deer skin. It was a deer head and a deer skin that some hunters had left. And he thought, I have an idea for another trick. And so he covered himself and he went up to see Mr. Elephant, and he tried to look like he was sick and tired. And Mr. Elephant said, "Hey, little dear, what's wrong with you? You're looking awfully sickly there." And little deer, really the rabbit, said, "Oh, that rabbit, he cast a spell on me, and I've been feeling mighty sick ever since." The elephant thought to himself, "Oh no, I don't want that rabbit to make me sick. I don't want him to cast a spell on me." So he said to the deer, "Now, little deer, if you run into Rabbit, you tell him I'm his friend and I don't mean him any harm at all. And I promise I won't sit on him." Well, that was good news for Rabbit, wasn't it? So then he went down to talk to Mr. Whale. And Mr. Whale said, "Oh my goodness, little deer, whatever happened to you?" And little deer said, well, really Rabbit, little deer said, "Oh, that rabbit, he cast a spell on me. He made me so sick. I've been sick now for days. I can hardly eat." And Whale, he got frightened too. He thought, I don't want an evil spell on me. So he thought, I better tell little deer that I like Mr. Rabbit. So he said, "Well, you tell little deer, you tell Mr. Rabbit that he's my friend and I don't mean him any harm at all. And I will be happy to see him the next time he comes by." And so little deer, alias little rabbit, hopped away and then said to himself, "Well, I may not be the strongest, and I may not be the biggest or the most powerful, but when I use my brain, I'm definitely the strongest. Well, you may not know this about me, but I just love quilts. I love to look at quilts. I love to sew quilts. In fact, this is a quilt that I made myself, and I really like it because it has so many bright colors in it. So I'm really happy to get to read this story to you called The Quilt Story. And you can see at the beginning of the book, there's a beautiful quilt picture with hearts and shooting stars and birds in it, and it's an important part of the story. In fact, it's really the whole story. A little girl's mother made the quilt to keep her warm when the snow came down long ago. She stitched the quilt by a yellow flame, humming all the time. She stitched the tails of falling stars, and she stitched the name Abigail. And you can see she's sewing it all by hand with a needle and thread. Abigail loved the quilt. She wrapped it around her in the quiet dark and watched the winter skies. Sometimes she saw a falling star. Sometimes Abigail played in the woods near her home. She had tea. Her dolls had tea. And the quilt, it had tea all over it. Sometimes she pretended the quilt was a gown. She wore it to town on her horse. Clip, clop, and it tore. So her mother stitched it up once more. Sometimes she played hide and seek with her sisters. Can you see where Abigail is? Do you think she's hiding under her quilt? She laughed and cried, "Don't peek!" And she hid under the quilt, and everyone found her. Sometimes Abigail was sick. She sneezed and sneezed, and then she slept under the quilt till she felt better. It's nice to have something warm and snuggly, isn't it, when you're not feeling well? One day, Abigail's family moved away across wide rivers and over a rock-hard trail. The quilt went too, not stuffed in trunks with the blankets and clothes. It kept the little girls warm from the wild winds, warm from the rain, warm from the sparkling nights. They built a new house in the woods. Abigail's father built it with his hatchet. Chop, chop, chop. He built her a new bed. Chip, chip, chip. He made her a new horse, too. He worked until curly shavings covered the floor, curly wood shavings, and everyone sneezed and said, "Welcome home," and was glad. But Abigail felt sad. New house, new horse, new bed. Everything smelled of fresh chops and chips. Everything but the quilt. So her mother rocked her as mothers do, then tucked her in, and Abigail felt at home again under the quilt. See, wherever she is, the quilt always makes her feel at home. One day, when the quilt was very old and very loved, Abigail folded it carefully and put it in the attic. Everyone forgot it was there. A gray mouse came and loved the quilt. Her babies were born on top of it. They grew fat and gray in the warm stuffing. When they got hungry, they ate a falling star. A raccoon came and loved the quilt. She dug a hole in a corner with her black paws and hid an apple there. A cat came and loved the quilt, a patchwork cat. It rolled on the stars and stuffing spilled out like snow. Then the cat curled up in the snow and purred. "Kitty, kitty," called the little girl. She found her cat, and she found the quilt, splashed with patterns of sun. The little girl wrapped the quilt around her, and she loved it too. "Can you make it like new?" she asked her mother. So her mother patched the holes. She pushed fresh stuffing in. She stitched long tails on the stars to swish across the quilt again. One day the little girl's family moved away across miles and miles of pavement and snaking gray highways. They found a new house, freshly cleaned, freshly waxed, freshly painted white. They unpacked and unpacked all night, and everyone sneezed on cardboard dust and said, "Welcome home," and was glad. And the little girl felt sad. Everything smelled of white paint and boxes, everything but the quilt. So her mother tucked her in, as mothers do, and she felt at home again under the quilt. So when you move, or if something new happens in your life, find something special that will always mean home to you. And there's Abigail's beautiful quilt at the end of the story. Okay, before we have our next story, we've got to sing Pop Goes the Weasel. All around the cobbler's bench the monkey chased the weasel. Monkey thought 'twas all in fun. Pop goes the weasel. Penny for a spool of thread, penny for a needle. That's the way the money goes. Pop goes the weasel. There we go. Now we have a draw and tell story. Remember where I'm going to draw a picture and tell you a story. So once upon a time, there was an old man and an old woman who lived in a round sod house. And their house was really close to a big round lake. And their house had one little window, a round window right here. At the other end of the lake, there were a couple of people that lived in tents. And every day, the people that lived in the tents would walk over to the lake to get water. And every day, the old woman who lived in the house would walk to the lake and then walk home again to get water too. Now, in the lake, there lived a lot of fish. Let's put in a ton of fish. So I think that's why those people liked living near the lake, because the fishing was very good. And besides the fish in the lake, there were a lot of birds that flew around over the lake again and again. A huge flock of birds that flew around and around the lake all day long. There's all those birds. Well, one day, the woman went to the lake and saw something very strange. She went home and said, "Husband, husband, what's going on?" And he stuck his head out the window and he saw, well, I don't know what he saw. His wife said, "I think it's the fish. The fish are flying away." And her husband said, "No, those aren't fish. Those are birds. The birds are all flying away. But look what you've got. I think that's the biggest bird of all. Looks to me like a great big turkey." And that's the story of Turkey Tale. This is a story, a patchwork story called Grandmothers Aprons. A long time ago, there was a little girl named Ellie, and Ellie was growing up in the city. That's where she lived with her mom and dad. But her grandparents still lived on a farm in the country. And every summer, Ellie got to go and stay with her grandparents. And it was one of her favorite times of year. Now, a lot of things would change on the farm. Sometimes there'd be a new kitty, or there'd be a new calf, or there might be a new baby horse, a new foal. But one thing that Ellie always knew would be the same would be her grandmother's aprons. Her grandmother had a whole drawer full of beautiful white aprons, and she always wore an apron every day, all day on the farm because she did so many chores. And Ellie loved Grandma's aprons. Now, Ellie loved to play outside in the summer on the farm, but sometimes the weather wasn't so good and it'd be rainy outside and she'd have to stay in, and that was kind of boring. I mean, she had her books and she had her blocks and things, but it really wasn't very much fun. And she said, "Grandma, I want to go outside, but I can't." And so Grandma said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make you a special inside place to play." And so her grandma took one of her aprons, a blue apron with yellow dots on it, and she put it on over the backs of 2 chairs, and she made a secret little hiding place, a little playhouse for Ellie. And that's where Ellie spent the rest of the day having a wonderful time playing in her secret place. One of the other things that Ellie liked to do on the farm was help Grandma collect the eggs. But you know, when you gather eggs, you have to put your hand underneath the hen to pull out the eggs from the nest. And Grandma would hold up her apron and she would gather all the eggs one by one as she got them into her apron. Well, Ellie said, "I want to try." And so she reached up and put her hand underneath the chicken, but the hen buck, 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 and tried to bite her. And Ellie got so nervous, she threw the egg into Granny's apron, and she broke all the eggs in the apron. And wouldn't you know it, no matter how many times Grandma tried to wash the apron, it still wouldn't come clean. So she said, "You know what? I think I'd like to have a nice yellow apron." And so she dyed the apron a nice yellow color like that. One of the other things they liked to do was go out and gather strawberries out in the woods. There were wild strawberries. And they would go out and they could pick them and they could eat as many as they wanted. But there were so many that they wanted to take some home. And Grandma said, "Gosh, I wish I had a basket to collect these, a berry basket." And Ellie said, "But you do, Granny. You have your apron. You can use your apron for a berry basket." So that's just what they did. But unfortunately, of course, there got to be stains from the strawberries on the apron. And no matter what Grandma did, they wouldn't come out. So she thought, how about a nice pink apron for me? I love the idea of that. And another time, they went on a picnic. And they forgot a picnic blanket, but you know what they used for a picnic blanket? They used one of Grandma's aprons. And so that white apron with the green grass stains on it, well, it wasn't so white anymore, so Grandma dyed it and she made it green. One day, Grandpa was out polishing everybody's shoes out in the shed, and he was using brown shoe polish, and Ellie was watching him, and he said, "Ellie, dear, would you go into the kitchen and get me one of Granny's rags so I can wipe off the shoe polish?" So Ellie ran in, and she looked around. She was looking for Granny, but Granny wasn't there. But she thought, "I know where the rags are." And so she went into the drawer and pulled out a big white rag. But neither she nor Grandpa realized it wasn't a rag. It was one of Grandma's aprons. And so that apron ended up with big brown stains on it. And so, of course, Grandma, she dyed it brown. So now she had a brown apron. And before you know it, it was the middle of the summer. It was 4th of July. And there was a big parade all through the town. And there were so many people in the parade, and Grandpa was one of them because he was a veteran. He'd been a soldier in the war. And everyone liked to stand and wave their American flags as the parade went by. Ellie didn't have a flag, but Grandma said, "You know what, Ellie? You can use my red, white, and blue apron, and you can wave that. That's bigger than anybody's flag." One of Ellie's favorite things to do when she was there at the farm was to run barefoot through the grass. You couldn't do that in the city. And one day she didn't notice a piece of glass, and she stepped on it. and it went right into her foot, and it started to bleed all over. So Grandma came out, and she took a white apron and she wrapped it around the wound, and she said, now that's good that it's bleeding because it'll wash all the dirt out of it. And of course, because of that, Grandma now has a red apron. Well, the very last week of the summer, it was time to Ellie to go back to the city. And so Grandma and Grandpa drove Ellie into town to meet her parents at the train. And because of that, Grandma wore her special going to town blue apron. Now, Ellie grew up and she became a mother, and then she became a grandmother herself. And of course her grandparents died, but Ellie had so many memories of all those summers on the farm, and she put all the memories into a patchwork quilt that she made out of her grandma's aprons. And there was nothing she liked better than to tell the story of all those summers and all those adventures on the farm and tuck all her grandchildren in underneath the patchwork quilt made from the aprons. And so now that we've put everybody to sleep under the patchwork quilt, it's time to say goodbye to you and to me. Bye-bye.